My grandmother tells me a story often of a time that I was in the backseat of her car and I said to her, "Grandma, I went to college and I still can't read." I was 3 years old and I had gone to kiddie college at Merritt Grove College in Detroit, Michigan on 6 Mile. And indeed, by the time I was 4 years old, I had learned to read because of a little device called Teach Me Reader, somewhere in the 80s. I have no idea what this thing was. But reading was a turning point for me. And it has been the love of my life for a very long time. And it changed the trajectory of my life at a very young age because it allowed me to escape the circumstances in which I lived. And the very story that I'm telling you was the story I wrote in my personal statement as I applied for doctoral studies at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And for that reason, I am so happy to have you here tonight because we must all know and understand the way in which reading unlocks the world and the infinite possibilities that one can imagine, even when they can't see them close to themselves. And so for me, that was the Babysitter's Club. I don't know about y'all, but I read all of them, Stacy and Christy and all the books, and I still have those texts because it was important. And it was a way to think about something when I was 8 or 9 years old that just didn't exist for me in my personal space. I am Dia Bryant. I am the executive director of the EdTrust-New York. I have had the privilege of serving as a teacher, instructional coach, district level leader, and now state advocate all over both New York City and New York State. And I'm so glad that you're here with us tonight to view the screening of this very important film. We are a statewide education policy and advocacy organization that uses data to elevate the stories of people who are at the margins, folks that we forget and erase in our policies and the way that we do our work in the education space. Beginning from birth all the way through the workforce, we work on equity issues that impact students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, because we know that they are often farthest from opportunity. Although many organizations speak up for adults, and many of you know those or work for those, we speak on behalf of students, families, and their futures, and the possibilities that could lie before them should we provide the opportunities that they deserve. Tonight, I am so happy to have you here to view this film, but to also be an advocate yourself following this sort of viewing. And I hope that you take what you learned tonight from our esteemed panel, as well as this sort of remarkable film, into your daily lives. As we view this film, I want you to think about what we were advocating for even before the pandemic. We were fighting for curriculum. We were fighting for good teacher prep. We were fighting for strong education leaders. Many of the problems that we had before the pandemic were exacerbated. I bet if you Google the word exacerbated, and you know how they have that little timeline, there's gonna be like a huge peak in 2020, right? And we'll look back on that and we'll know why that was, right? But it's important that the students who sit in our classrooms right now understand what that word means, right? That they can spell it, that they understand how it's used, when it's used, and how they can use it to address the complex issues that our society currently faces and will face in the future. ELA proficiency statewide is down. Our children are struggling and challenged to read. And the interrupted instruction over the last 3 years did not help, as I just mentioned. However, even before, we had a reading crisis, particularly in the early grades. And recent data that was released last fall told us exactly what we thought we knew, but with numbers and information. And at this point, I feel hopeful that this issue has finally risen to the top of national headlines. People are starting to understand the ways in which we have underserved children and have not put them on the best path to being literate, civil participants in our democracy. It is critical. One scroll down Twitter tells you that the issues of our society are becoming more complex around race, gender, sexuality, politics, and our children will need to speak, write, and listen across lines of difference in ways that we have never been able to do. And we need to make sure that they can do that. That is so important. And so tonight, as you watch this powerful film that actually features LeVar Burton. I don't know if y'all remember watching Reading Rainbow. I'm like giving all my age here right now, right? But I love that he reemerged on this issue, right? Because we need him right now. And there's a little bit of nostalgia that sort of calls us in and makes us remember not just his show, The Reading Rainbow, right? Singing is not my ministry. But it calls us in to a time where reading was central to how we thought about teaching and learning. It calls us in as a math teacher, but it calls us into our teacher prep. What were those classes like? How did they feel? How do children learn best, right? So as we watch this film tonight, I hope that you will think deeply about the way in which reading has impacted your lives. And imagine even a moment that perhaps you've been to a foreign country and you didn't understand the language. And then imagine moving through life every day, seeing signs that you have no idea what they say, moving through a world that you don't understand. As a Black woman from Detroit, growing up in the 80s, that is scary. As the mother of 2 children, a 7 and a 13-year-old, that scares me. So I'm hopeful that this sparks more than interest, more than concern, more than an op-ed, more than a paper. We need a movement. And as a baby of the 80s, I dare to say that a hashtag is not a movement. We need action. We need action from our education leaders. We need action from our legislators. And we must demand it. And so I hope as we view this film, I'm excited too because it's the first time I'm seeing it, we sort of sit in that a little bit. What does it feel like to move through the world and actually not know, right? And think about what reading's done for you. I think I got a magazine and 2 books in my bag right now, right? Like, there's always something. So I invite you to enjoy this film, take notes, create some inquiry within yourself, inquire about the work that you do and the work that folks do around you, and think about the big questions we should be asking the people that we voted into power and that we've placed into power, and how we make them do what's right for the youngest New Yorkers, our children.
I hope you enjoyed the film. If you're like me, it brought up a lot of different feelings. I jotted down a few of them. So anger, a little bit of outrage, some sadness, but also a lot of hope, and maybe most importantly, a lot of urgency, right? Like, we can do something about this. And, as you watch this, your mind might have gone to, right, this was kind of a national frame. You might have thought, well, what's happening here in New York City? What's happening in New York? And so it was kind of that sense of urgency, as well as that curiosity, that led us about a year ago to start to think about, let's do a landscape. Let's find out what's happening across the state when it comes to both early literacy and whether or not we're aligned to the science of reading that we just learned about. And so what I'm going to do tonight is just share some very high-level findings from a report that we're going to be releasing hopefully in the next few days. So think of this as a sneak preview of the findings that came out of this report. And just going to share those right now, and then we're going to kick it over to our panel. So I'll go pretty quickly. So for starters, as was said throughout the film, we believe reading is a civil right? It undergirds everything that we care about for schools, for communities, for families. Like, this is it. This is at least for us, this is the equity issue. It's the social justice issue. I'm not going to go into the stats too much. I do want to just point out the NAACP scores. So this came up in the film. NAACP stands for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a federal test. New York ranks 37th in fourth grade reading. I think here in New York, we sometimes like to make fun of some other states, thinking maybe there's one down south called Florida, some other ones. Florida ranks 6th in reading. Mississippi ranks 22nd. So there's a lot of work for New York to do. Just one more stat about the NAACP scores. We're now at the same levels, students are now at the same level they were at as in 1998. Okay, so 2022, we're at 1998 levels. And I won't go into the details now, but know that some of these proficiency rates are much lower when we look both for students from low-income communities, but also some of the upstate cities. I live in Rochester. We have 9 out of 10 kids can't read. So it's a crisis. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think what keeps me up at night, and frankly, I think what should keep all of us up at night is, I think we run the risk of a lost generation of students, right? So these students that went through the pandemic that didn't get these foundational reading skills, what's going to happen to them as they move through school, as they move through third grade and they get to, fifth grade science, right? And they're having trouble reading the background that they need to succeed. Unfortunately, we know what happens, right? The research is pretty clear. Dropout rates go way up. And we know that has implications for schools, but also communities. So we're worried, right? And that's why we have to have urgency. The good news, right, as you saw here, is this is a solvable crisis, okay? We know what to do. We know, you just learned about the science of reading. We know that the evidence is clear. The research shows what we need to do. Unfortunately, there's a lack of urgency here in New York State. We'll talk more about that, both tonight, but also in the coming months, and you'll hear more about it from our panelists in a few minutes. State leaders aren't talking about this issue, and I should, well, I won't go into the details. Some of our educational state leaders are not talking about this issue. And again, this led to the report that I'm going to talk about right now, again, that we're going to be releasing very shortly. So what we did is a mixed methods, year-long project. So we did a poll of public school parents across the state, 800 parents. We did a survey to every district in the state to try and find out what curriculum they're using, right? Is it evidence-based or is it not evidence-based? We did focus groups with teachers and students from across the state, and then also interviews and meetings with stakeholders both in New York and across the nation. And what we found, and I think one thing this came up in the report or in the film, right? 30 states, over 30 states have adopted policies aligned with the science of reading. New York has very little, if anything, on the books when it comes to science of reading and policy. And so that plays a big reason in some of those outcomes that you just saw. So what did we find? One of the key findings, and this is not a surprise for those of you who follow education in New York State, we have what's called a local control system, right, where we let school districts make many of the instructional decisions on how and what we teach. And actually the survey that we'll be sharing later showed that actually two of the most popular four popular curriculums are those non-evidence-based balanced literacy curriculums that you just saw in the film. Probably not a surprise to those of you here in New York. So that's an area we need to work on. Our parent survey showed that there's overwhelming support for the science of reading, right? Both the concept, both doing it in school, but also policy changes at the state level. And they also want more support from schools in helping their kids learn how to read. As you saw, there's a lot that parents can do, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then just the final two things. So teachers are still learning about this, particularly those in the middle and high school, but they're generally supportive. And more importantly, they see what happens, right? Talk to a middle school teacher, a high school teacher. They know what happens to kids that can't read, right? They're disengaged, they check out, sometimes they act out. And there's a clear line, and that came through in the research that we did. And then finally, teacher preparation programs are a big challenge when it comes to this. There was a study done 2 years ago that showed 1 out of 3, only 33% of our teacher preparation programs are teaching new teachers how to use the science of reading in the classroom. So think about that and what the impact that's going to happen. So we can't blame the teachers. They weren't being taught how to do this. So just out of those findings, we came up with several recommendations. And I'm just going to quickly run through those and then want to give plenty of time for our panelists. So number one, we got to get towards evidence-based curriculum, evidence-based instructional resources. There's a lot of ways around that. You're going to hear from some people, well, it's a local control issue. We can't do that at the state level. That's BS. There's a lot that you can do to make that happen. That the report talks about that. We need to get our teacher prep programs aligned with the science of reading. We need to do a better job of progress monitoring in K-3. It's too late to say at the end of 3rd grade, right, that our kids are struggling. We need to give them the support they need in kindergarten, 1st grade, to give them what they need. Teachers are going to need coaching, they're going to need support, they're going to need professional development, right? Many of them were never taught these skills. It's going to be a big lift. They need a lot of support, and we'll hear more about what New York City is going to be doing around that. Public reporting and transparency. So believe it or not, the state has no idea what curriculum districts are using across the state. They don't collect that information. We had to do it in this survey, and it was, we didn't hear from every district. Districts don't post on their website. There's no requirement that they share how they're teaching their students how to read. So we need to do a better job on that piece. And then the next 3, I think, really all go together. And it's really around this concept that schools can't and shouldn't have to do this work alone, right? So you saw in the film, there's so much that parents can do, right? So much that they can do. They need to be better supported. They need to learn how to be advocates, right, in finding out, is their school using an evidence-based curriculum? Expanded learning opportunities. We're going to hear more from Danielle in a minute. There's a role for after-school programs, summer programs. There's a role for tutoring. And guess what? That could actually be aligned with what schools are doing, right? Imagine that if we can get everyone on the same page. And then finally, again, the film did a great job of this. Like, kindergarten's too late to start this work, right? So there's so much we can do in that 0 to 5 space, empowering parents, empowering caregivers to give kids tools that they need to develop their reading skills. So again, all those 3 go together. And then just quickly the last 2. So blended learning and technology might not be something that you think about. There's a study that came out actually before the pandemic that showed in a typical 5th grade classroom, there's 7 different grade levels, abilities, right? This is before the pandemic. So teachers need help in differentiating instruction, right? Making sure that each student is getting what they need, and technology can do a good job of helping them do that. So that's another area that we're going to focus on. And then finally, just building out what Dia shared at the outset, right? We need to build a movement. We need to build awareness. We need to build that sense of urgency, but it's got to be a statewide movement, and it's got to include parents, advocates, all of us here in this room. So I hope that's helpful. Again, these are, and really this report is just the first step. This is a long-term movement. EdTrust is going to play a role, but we certainly want to partner with everyone here in the room, others across the state. And again, this is just the first step. So with that, I want to bring our panelists up, and Dia, and we're going to hear from them.
We're thrilled to have these 3 amazing literacy leaders who are working in our state and across our nation to advance much of the work that Kareem talked about. And so here to share their knowledge with us are Jason Borges, who is the Executive Director of New York City Public Schools Literacy Collaborative, where he leads literacy efforts across New York City, in our nearly 1,800 schools. Could you believe that? We also are honored to have the Honorable Robert C. Carroll, the Assembly member who represents the 44th District in Brooklyn and has been leading a lot of the work around dyslexia and literacy for our students. Thank you for being here. And finally, we have Danielle Guindo, who is the executive director of the Read Alliance, which is a very important organization that supports high school students to provide literacy instruction to elementary school students. And they are doing magical work. And I have to say this, that they have just expanded their work to Reading, Pennsylvania. And I just love that Reading spells reading. Right, so I had to say that. Puns. So this film is powerful, right? And it confirms a lot of what we know about the power of literacy and the history of anti-literacy laws and the way in which that still exists in how we move about education today. Would love to hear, what are you taking away? Sort of what's sticking with you? What's standing out? Let's start with Jason and then pop in.
All right. Thanks, and good evening, everyone. I think this is the third time I've watched the film the past, actually, 4 days. And so much has resonated with me. Thinking about Kareem is a national treasure, first of all, but calling out the exclusion, the historical exclusion of the lack of access for many populations historically, number one. Number two, to hear and see particularly what was going on in the 0 to 5 space that we saw, I believe it was in Virginia Beach. Just incredible. It's like when I go into classrooms, I'm looking to see what are those explicit, right, those research-proven practices happening. And in those households, it was just evident and just inspirational for us to take back here in New York. And the last thing I'll say is that Miss Causey, the teacher, is like a case study of teachers that we have here in New York, where I'm sure Danielle can attest to this as well, but what happens is when teachers know that something's not working, they're gonna try to seek out for what does work. And she mentioned, I'm making my own curriculum here. And you kind of go adrift when you're doing that, particularly when you're working in isolation in a school. But to see when the coach came in and the coach brought evidence-based curriculum to operate from and then was receiving supports, that's what really improves practice and outcomes for our kids.
Yeah, and I would say that, Jason, thanks for what you had shared. I would say that what we've seen, at least at Read Alliance, and we've been partnering in schools for 23 years, and the extraordinary power of teachers who believe in their kids and know what it means to actually foster success for their kids. And I think what resonates for me whenever I see something like this that we just watched, or listen to a recent podcast that came out recently, or read all the articles that have been published over the last couple of years, it's that kids have the power and potential to learn to read, and we need to believe in them. And that was the founding core principle of the organization that I lead, Read Alliance, and also what all these teachers and school leaders and all of us believe. And all the advocates are out there shouting the rooftops that that's what is possible. And then the other thing, there's a lot, and I'll say this. The other thing that's resonating that I've been taking from it is, we've known, we actually have our director of evaluation in the audience who is a Read alum. She was one of our very first teen tutors. We've always seen progress The children in our program have always improved in their reading skills, and we have always used phonics. And throughout our history, we're 23 years old, obviously there's been a lot of pressure over that time to rethink that and maybe change or move away from phonics or do something a little bit different. And we, thank goodness, stayed the course. And it's incredibly validating, though, of course, incredibly frustrating and angering and all the things that Jeff mentioned, that folks were not also seeing that all along, seeing what we saw. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more, but I'll stop.
You know, I mean, I think Miss Causeways, that was her name, the teacher. I mean, I think her honesty that something wasn't working for her students, I think that is exceptionally rare. And I think it must be noted. But I think also, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We really need to call out Lucy Calkins and Fontes and Pinnell. What they have done and the damage they have done is not just what Jeff said, a generation, a pandemic generation of children. It's 40 years. This science is unbelievably old. We have known what has worked for generations and generations and generations. And it's really sad that we have to be up here in 2023 talking about something that people in the 1920s and 30s knew very clearly.
And I would assume that for that reason, you have decided as an assembly member in the legislature to address the issue head on. And would love to hear about how you're thinking about that and some of the barriers you think that there are to actually build a coalition of the willing who will become active on this issue. We hear lots of folks purporting to care, but their actions do not line up to either the data or what our kids need. Would love to hear how you're thinking about the barriers and how we actually mitigate them.
Well, I hope you won't mind if I'm honest.
We know who you are. Come on.
Let me go back to honesty. The reason I care about honesty is, I don't know, most people here don't know who I am. You know, I had a teacher who was honest with my mother in first grade. And she told her that your son can't read. And I suspect that your son is dyslexic. That changed my life. It allowed my parents to get me the supports and the interventions that I so desperately needed. That was in 1993. That was 30 years ago. The sad truth is that most children in 1993 and in 2023, their parents are lied to. They're told they'll catch up. They're told they're young for their age. They're told, oh, they're making progress. They're utter lies. And the fact of the matter is, you know, this year, or early last year, we passed a bill to have just open conversations. It was called the Dyslexia and Dysgraphia Task Force. It would have required 11 experts to hold public hearings throughout the state of New York and to write a report to the state legislature on recommendations we should take for early childhood literacy. The governor vetoed that bill on Thanksgiving. Pretty apt. She claims to care about families. She claims that she cares about women. And the reason I bring up that she claims that she cares about women is I speak to parents all the time about this issue, and 80% of the time, it's mom. 80% of the teachers I speak to in elementary schools who care desperately about being able to reach their students are women. You know, she is our first female governor. I think it is exceptionally cruel for her to say that New York State, which is 37th in reading attainment, but first in education spending, didn't have the money to have 4 public hearings. It's glib, it's insincere, it's a lie. So, you know, we're going to pass the bill again. We also have a Right to Read Act bill. We're going to introduce a bill about dyslexia. In the next couple of weeks, we also have a bill about having medical insurance help pay for dyslexia and dysgraphia diagnoses. Those bills, unfortunately, face very, very stiff headwinds because of you know, falsehoods about local control, about the fact that we have solved these issues, that these issues are not nearly as prevalent as people say they are. when Jeff had mentioned that he's from Rochester. 90% of the school children in the Rochester public schools can't read. You're destroying people's lives. The state government has very few real powers. One of them is education. It's insane that New York has almost zero curriculum laws. We're one of the few states in the nation. It's pretty obnoxious of us to turn our noses up at Florida or Mississippi or Arkansas or Louisiana or Texas. I get that they're red states. They kill us on literacy education every day of the week.
Every day of the week. Absolutely true, and thank you for those reflections. Jason, we've been pretty vocal about, I'm a former New York City principal, so let me be clear. We've been pretty vocal about the need for New York City to narrow the number of curricula in play throughout the city, right? E for E is back there. I think it was this very room. And we're excited that you all are starting to make a move, right? And we're hopeful that that will provide impetus for the state to do something about the disparities around. Talk to us a little bit about that and how, you are thinking about generating buy-in and, sort of coalition building around the work that's ahead.
Yeah. Change management is complex, but exciting. It's exciting, complex work, but, working closely with superintendents right now we've been surveying the curriculum over the past year. We've been having dialogue with them about what curriculum you're using does not match the research base, things of that nature. And that's a work in progress. But I will say that a year ago, our chancellor, who on his agenda number one is literacy. I've been in and out of the DOE for over 20 years, and this is the first chancellor who's coming out and saying, no, this is the number one agenda item. But a year ago, he came out and said, we're going to mandate that every single elementary school, this is the start, adopts a foundational skills curriculum, a phonics curriculum. So what we did was our team had to go through all the surveys of every elementary school across New York City and basically tell schools, nope, this is not approved. You're going to have to adopt X curriculum or one that's on an approved list that met criteria, and you're going to have to get training. That's the start. However, learning, I'm getting towards the buy-in here, is that there's more to it than just a curriculum. We have to, from central to superintendents and district teams, to principals and teachers, all build a knowledge base around the science of reading. Because historically, a couple of my colleagues are here, that we have often trained directly to teachers. And Doug Fuchs from Vanderbilt University told me, he goes, you're training the Navy SEALs out there because the school leaders are missing. And this is what Mississippi and other states did to start changing the tide, was that we all have to speak the same language and have an understanding of that. So what we did, though, was this spring, every elementary principal is receiving training in letters, the language essentials training for reading and spelling. And that is giving them the background knowledge that they need, but also ways in which that they can know the look-fors, know about assessments, and ways in which that they're going to improve their literacy ecosystem in the early grades. That's number one. We're going to do the same with teachers next year. But getting to the buy-in, it's through outcomes. Because success leads to achievement, achievement leads to motivation. And when teachers start feeling successful in achievement, right, then they're more motivated, and then you start building peer pressure within schools to start saying, I want to do that. So that's That's one big effort, and the curriculum effort that we're working with districts. But it's the proof's in the pudding, and to create that synergy and energy amongst schools as well. Other piece I will also say is that we want to build lab sites across each district and work with our superintendent's teams to identify those principals that are change agents. And this is actually what Mississippi did. And through those early adopters, we need that, not only going back to that peer pressure amongst colleagues, but they need to see it. And they need to hear the stories around what's happening to change those tides, what a leader's doing, what the teachers are doing, what paraprofessionals are doing, and how we're authentically engaging with families as well around these efforts.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of the work has been like the ideology of Chancellor Banks. And I think that it is critical that community-based organizations have sort of shown up and amplified the message and sort of prioritized this and sort of provided some of the momentum for you. Danielle, as we think about that and sort of what is the role that CBOs, advocacy orgs, technical assistance organizations play, particularly in such a large city at scale, what do you think they should be focused on, and how do you think they show up for this new initiative?
Thank you for the question. So there's a number of ways in which community-based organizations have been and will continue to be partners in this effort. I think, you know, when we're in a school, so, you know, speaking on behalf of Read Alliance, when we're in a school, we're after school. And we're providing the kind of intervention that well-resourced families and schools provide their students, individualized, structured, extra, after school. I remember somebody asked me, well, you're doing what the schools should be doing anyway. It's like, okay, you know, you may think that, but there's a lot of kids and a lot of families in very well-resourced schools who come from very well-resourced families who are paying extra to do exactly what organizations like Read Alliance and our partners do. And so I think that's one thing I want to put an exclamation point on, which is that every child deserves that, right? And so let us continue to be partners with like-minded educational leaders in order to help move the needle in child success. I would say there was something that you mentioned, Jason, which I thought was so true, and that is, you know, it's true for adults and it's true for kids. You know, motivation comes from outcomes, comes from success. And I just, 2 hours ago now, I guess, came from a completion ceremony from a school that we partner in that was celebrating the end of their program. And I had some time to talk to some of the kids, and they're all first and second graders. And, you know, we were sitting there and I said, so what did you like the most about this program? And, you know, a lot of them were talking like, I love to read with my teen, I love my tutor, I love my tutor. Because they're all matched one-on-one with a high school student, which you can imagine how much they love that. But there were a couple of kids who had said, I progressed so much. I used to be a level 1 and now I'm a level 4. And I just can't wait to get to level 5. And there were so many more who started chiming in like, oh yeah, I loved when I moved along. I loved when I progressed. And it's like, that's success. Of course, that's right. We all thrive on that. And so that's another aspect that I think had been missing. So there's true success that the kids can feel. And we hear all the time, I have some amazing team members in the audience today that will tell you themselves. We have a lot of information directly from teachers and principals who work with us, who talk about how differently kids show up in the day school classroom. They show up so confident, so ready to learn, and they elevate the whole class, and the teachers themselves feel the same way. The teachers are getting instruction, or teachers who've been working with Read Alliance have been getting instruction on how to teach phonics for years. And we've heard about how that elevates their colleagues as well. So that, what you described, Jason, is a real thing. We see it. The stats, of course, have borne out, that as well. So I did want to, just share that story.
I love that.
That is just,
That's amazing. I mean, my first grader is somewhere back in the back, probably. I don't know where he is. But that is like a magical feeling. both a teacher, former teacher, and a parent. Like, we really look forward to that.
And the teens too.
Yeah.
They said the same. They were like, I'm so excited to see them learn to read. When I noticed that they were learning to read, I mean, they're so proud. And so when the kid is enthusiastically supported by cheerleaders, especially those that are a little bit older than them and look like them, it just makes all the difference.
Yeah. So we don't have a ton of time, but I'd like to welcome a couple of questions from the audience, if you three don't mind. Anyone? Would you mind projecting pretty loudly, because we actually don't have a microphone to bring you, and I'm like all ADA conscious. Oh, we do have one. There's one here.
There we go. Hi, good evening. My name is Lupe Hernandez. I am here on behalf of the public advocate, and I thank you for inviting us to this. But I'm also a public school parent of a child that had got great relief from attending an after-school program at Churchill, where it really helped him to learn how to read during the pandemic, mind you. So it resonated with me quite much. And I'm also born and raised in Oakland, California, so full circle. My question to you this evening is, I'm really excited about some of the work that this administration is doing in tackling and changing this curriculum, or the practices in the curriculum that teachers are using. And I'm hearing a lot about pilot programs starting kindergarten, first grade, elementary schools getting these universal diagnosis. What are we doing? I guess it's directed to you, Jason. I apologize. What are we doing to address our older students? So those in middle and high school that, I don't want them to be excluded from this great opportunity. And how are we going to address these students so that we don't leave them out and that they also have the opportunities to succeed and learn to read? Thank you.
I promise I didn't plant that.
No, it's actually something that I did want to talk about earlier, because when we talk about the science of reading, so much of it is focused on the foundational aspects, right? Like foundational skills, phonics, fluency, but there's a whole evidence base about how to support students in grades 3 and up, and there's a lot of supports that we need to get, but like, for instance, I'll start even with thinking about reading across content areas. In grades 3 through 5, right, there's this misnomer that kids stop learning how to read, right, by third grade, right? Well, they're learning how to read more challenging text and to read different genres of text within disciplines. There's things that we need to do. We need to know when to teach explicitly, right? There's a strong evidence base around that. 2, vocabulary, comprehension. If anybody's familiar with the Scarborough reading rope and all the components that make up comprehension, like background knowledge and all those things. The good news is that what's really in vogue is knowledge building curriculum, right? So it really strengthens the comprehension. What we're also doing though right now is in 160 schools, actually it's 180, I would say half of them or over half of them are in middle schools and high schools. And we're doing intervention work, and we're seeing that there's a large number of adolescents that need intervention. We're providing it. The outcomes are promising right now. Stay tuned for that by June. And we're going to expand those efforts next year. But we also need to build in the high leverage practices with their secondary schools and teachers to start incorporating them more. And this is the tough part. It's got to be across the disciplines. So that's going to be another significant part of our efforts in the next 2 years, is to support our secondary schools.
Powerful. And I think that's where we're going to need you, Assemblymember Carroll, right? To move some work, right? So we're almost out of time, and I have to ask my favorite question of each of you. And I'm gonna give you a moment to think about it, but keep it a little bit brief so that folks can kind of mingle before we go. If you had a magic wand and it could change the future for children, particularly in the literacy space, as we think about where we are in 2023, what would you do? And let's start with the assembly member when you're ready. I know it takes a moment. You're like, which one? Where do I go? We'll start with the assembly member and we'll just go down.
So, I think foundational skills changed my life. And because of that, I do have certain blind spots. But, I think it is so critical. I think that the reason why Lucy Calkins and her acolytes are so pernicious is because their idea is so evocative. It's an idea that's an adult idea. We want people to love to read. We want people to be creative. We want people to be critical thinkers. Those are things as adults that we cherish and that we long for. We forget, though, that children are not adults. They're novices. And so they so desperately need these skills so that they can then move on to that critical thinking. And we forget that, and that if we could realize that schools that are rooted in foundational skills will actually create the most creative, the most imaginative, students with real ingenuity, and that we then don't forget, all of these moments are a little bittersweet for me, because I've been having this conversation. My mother was so traumatized by my schooling experience. She went back to school. She became an Orton Gillingham specialist and worked in public schools in New York City for 20 years. There are so many people who for the last 50, 60 years have been doing this work, mostly doing this work with children who are struggling with dyslexia. It's beautiful that we've brought this now to the fore. We're finally having this conversation out loud, but that we don't forget those students, because as much as Right to Read is a beautiful movie, it's a phenomenal movie, not all children are going to be those beautiful little kids who, given the right supports at 5, 6, 7 years old, they start taking off. So let's not forget those kids either, but foundational skills, foundational skills, foundational skills. Picasso could paint you a portrait that looked realistic. He chose not to. Let's remember that.
I think very simply, we know what works, right? And I think we're at a moment, my parents in the audience too, and my dad taught English and taught remedial English also early in his career. And we were having a conversation earlier this week and realized that the same things that he saw as a young teacher, we're seeing now. Nothing has changed, really. Some has changed, but a lot of what we've been talking about, children are experiencing in school when they're struggling to read, is very much the same. And we don't want to continue convening like this, talking about how frustrated we are, talking about we know what works. We're first in the country for spending, and then 37th in terms of outcomes. I would wave a wand and make sure that is absolutely not happening anymore. That we would make sure that we come together as like-minded advocates and champions for children and believe in their possibilities for success and use that will to actually implement what works.
Yeah, I think if we had policy all the way down to teacher preparation and supports, like still need coaching within our schools, highly trained coaches, to be able to do this work, that would be the magic wand. But I also say this, with the science of reading, folks, what we all need to do is we got to get a curricular package, because I'm not going to call out a name of somebody who really marketed this really well, but created a package, right, that went from everything from coaches to a university to the whole package. The science of reading, we need to do that. We need to have that package as well.
Listen,
Can I say one
Of course
thing?
you can.
I was listening to other things, something came to me. I think one of the things that gets really frustrating around the science of reading, or where people, sometimes there's a lost in translation, is that people correctly go and say, well, you know, children learn differently, or children have different interests, or children have different experiences. And again, that is true, as long as they then have certain foundations. And I just wanted to underline that. So, you know, if we could have schools that there's no reason to time a test for anybody unless you're auditioning for Jeopardy. There's no reason, you know, to tell somebody you've got to take 4 years of Spanish or Latin or French if that's not going to work for them. Just like there's no reason to tell somebody, you know, you must complete X, Y, or Z. But if they have the foundational skills, you can give them that freedom of choice. Because you can then say, you know what, I'm not worried. We decide to box children in because we haven't given them those skills. So we say, well, I'm afraid I didn't give you those skills, so now I need you to check 5 boxes to prove that you have them. If you do it first, you then can give real freedom to kids. And I think that's something I can be severe around these conversations. I know that. I get very emotional, and I forget that, you know, I want my son to be able to have that freedom of choice. And if we give him those foundational skills, then we don't have to worry about the rest.
Absolutely. Whew. So I thank each of you for what you do every day and the causes that you champion daily with children, with teachers, with legislators, and how you lead masses of people within our state and here within our city. It was said over and over and over that this is a civil rights issue, and I must remind us that post-Civil War, during Reconstruction, there were anti-literacy laws throughout the South that it took my ancestors decades to remove. And they wondered a lot about why people didn't want them to read. And they alluded to that fact in the film. But what we know about history and policies is that even when they are changed, often remnants of their DNA continue to exist in our culture, in the way we behave, and in the way we treat one another. And so, I hope that you leave here today thinking about how we cannot let history repeat itself for the children of New York, for the children that live in your building, for the children on your block, for the children in your bodegas, the children that you encounter every day on the train. Because there's a serious risk if we allow history to repeat itself for us, because they are meant to be our doctors. They are meant to be our leaders. They are meant to solve climate change. You know, so we have to ensure that they can manage these issues, and they can only do it if they are free to think. And the path to freedom, as Kareem named, and as my ancestor Frederick Douglass named, is through literacy. Thank you so much for being here. Have an amazing night.